all of our condolences to you, the members of your district, and particularly the loved ones of those that they have been lost down there at that condominium. As I understand, you're on the site. Give us a sense of what's going on.
Thank you, David, and we appreciate the outpouring of condolences and prayers throughout the last 2 weeks. This is a tragedy of devastating proportions, one that is literally the stuff of nightmares. People were sleeping in their beds when their building came crashing down with them in it. I'm across from the site in one of the trailers one of the response trailers that is on the site. And families are down the street. They're still trying to pick up the pieces of their lives, both survivor families who lost everything and families who lost their loved ones and now are, hoping to find that the remains of their loved ones are found so they can bury them properly. My job is to help make sure that we can help put these folks' lives back together to the degree possible, and make sure that we can minimize their pain and give them the assistance they need because they've lost everything.
Yeah, helping them try to put some semblance of their lives back together could well take years, as you know. That's not a quick process. At the same time, there's a lot of other things going on at that site with the recovery, but also presumably an investigation into what happened, because we also naturally ask ourselves, could it happen elsewhere? For example, in your district or along that shore there, in southern Florida?
Not just along the shoreline here, but the coastline all the way up the East Coast and around the coastline of the United States. I mean, this is not the only building built in the 1980s and earlier. We have in this county, even with 40-year inspection requirements, this still happened. And so getting to the bottom of it is absolutely critical. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, the federal agency responsible for reviewing construction disasters, is really on the case from the first few days after the collapse. They are forensically examining every aspect of this collapse, and they make recommendations on what kinds of building code changes, engineering policies and practices, and other kinds of recommendations that are made by them as a result of their review, so we can make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. But we should not assume that this is the only building and that this was a unique situation, because we don't want anyone else to ever have to live through or not survive a tragedy like this.
Congresswoman, is there any thought, and maybe it's too soon, to have national standards adopted? Is part of the problem here perhaps that there's variation at the state and local level?
I really, David, I've been thinking about that since the first day that this happened, and I came down from D.C. on the morning plane. Obviously, building code standards and practices are handled at the state and local level. We do have standards that are tangentially related at the federal level, and so I do think it's important to look into what standards should be adopted at the national level at a minimum, because this is, like I said, a tragedy of epic proportions. We can't allow this to ever happen again. And so making sure that there is at least a minimum floor of requirements, particularly as a building ages, where you have inspections that are that are performed and requirements for repairs and refurbishment to be done, because you don't want, and then we also have to take a look at coastal resiliency, because to the degree that saltwater intrusion impacts buildings and their stability, we need to look at what kind of resiliency factors we need to have built into buildings going forward.
Well, that's a great term I hadn't heard before, coastal resiliency, and it really does trigger in my mind the question of climate change. Whether climate change may actually be affecting buildings, as you say, not just in southern Florida, but up the coastline, and whether because of climate change, perhaps we shouldn't be rebuilding, for example, in Surfside, where that condominium was.
No, I think it's far too early to jump to any conclusions like that. And I don't think this is going to get to the point where we say we shouldn't be building on our coastlines. When we build, we need to make sure, and we should always be ensuring that there is that we're taking coastal resiliency into account, that we make sure that we don't further erode our beaches, which our beaches are obviously having a serious erosion problem to begin with, but also that the natural elements aren't impacting our infrastructure to such a degree that we're not considering that when we build, and that we don't think about making sure that we can have the shoring up, for lack of a better term, of these structures because we know that that nature's elements impact them over the years.
Congressman, it's awfully difficult for us, much less you, to turn our attention to any other subject than other than that tragedy since we first learned about it down in Surfside. But there are other issues in the country. I want to turn to the question of voting rights, which is certainly pending up on Capitol Hill. Various
Yes.
states with initiatives like Georgia, like Florida, like Texas about voting. Give us a sense of where you think that stands right now in the Congress.
Well, I think that with the Supreme Court decision last week on the Arizona voter suppression laws that they essentially said were not violative of the Voting Rights Act and and their decision further erodes the Voting Rights Act, it's more important than ever that that the Senate pass H.R. 1 and send it to the president. We have to make sure that we don't turn the clock back when it comes to making sure that people have the ability to have maximum access to the polls. I mean, obstacles thrown in the path of individuals who are trying to exercise their franchise is a way to make sure that a political party can shape the electorate to get the result that they want, rather than what the intention of our voting practices are, and that's to elect people that are the choice of the majority of voters that show up to vote. Throwing obstacles in the path of those voters is unconstitutional, and we need to make sure that we don't have the law interfere with that.
Well, Congressman, whatever the merits of SR1 and HR1, as a practical matter, it's awfully difficult for the Congress to deal with things having to do with how they get elected, isn't it? As a practical matter, it's just similar to building codes. This has been done at the state and local level. Do you have hopes or expectations actually Congress might come together with some national approach to voting rights?
I really hope so. I mean, I hope the Senate, given that have a majority, although very slim, in the United States Senate, as well as the House of Representatives, are able to come together and find a pathway to ensure that we can maximize people's ability to vote, rather than what the Supreme Court and Republicans have just done, which is further narrow people's ability to go to the polls and have a lot of opportunity to do so, to express their opinion on who they want to represent them at every level of government. Right now, that pathway is shrinking, and we need to make sure that we change the law at the national level to ensure that your geography, where you live, doesn't impact your ability to cast your ballot.